I am going to show you 10 base building tips that dramatically increased my base efficiency and helped me reach the endgame as early as day 12 during my 100-day challenge. I've watched plenty of progression guides in my free time, and while many of them contain useful information, most of them only provide extremely basic instructions, but very few of them answer the question that actually matters. How do you build a base that progresses as fast as possible? After watching this video, your next playthrough of Palworld will be significantly easier. We all know that higher work level pals gather resources faster, but just how much faster? The best way to start approaching productivity is to change the way you think about progression. Instead of focusing on the base skill levels of our base pals, we should be focusing on the number of base slots being used instead. First, I tested how much stone could be gathered in a single in-game day by pals with different mining levels, and the results are as follows. Palworld tricks us into believing that upgrading our base level and allowing us to add more workers in is the main way of increasing our productivity. But in reality, the fastest progression comes from upgrading the quality of your workers. Instead of spending one day collecting materials to upgrade your base level by 1, you could obtain a level 4 mining pal in that time period, effectively giving you 6 additional pal slots. And once you start factoring in work speed traits such as remarkable craftsmanship and artisan, this gap becomes even larger. When completing a task, you should always consider the number of slots you will need to commit to that task, since base slots are extremely limited, especially in the beginning of the game. In my previous video, I shared 5 massive tips that helped me complete Palworld in just 100 days. And if you have not seen that yet, be sure to check it out after this video, as it shows you how to raise your level and capture level 60 pals without glitches on the default settings as early as day 4. One of the biggest misconceptions in Palworld is that the best base pals are locked behind breeding, and while there are definitely optimal work pals for each task, there are several level 4 work pals that can be captured surprisingly early and will carry your base all the way to endgame, such as Blazamute, Raloha, Gangler, Anubis or Splatterina, and Azuramain. Although there are better endgame pals that can generate better returns, they require technique handbooks since their work levels are typically lower to compensate. Until then, vanilla level 4 work pals are better until you obtain the necessary handbooks. For example, I conducted an experiment using a lettuce plantation and used Braloha versus Prunelia, which has level 3 planting and gathering. For Prunelia, she requires 50 seconds to plant and 100 seconds to gather, netting you 1 lettuce every 10 seconds. However, a plain Braloha would require 30 seconds to plant and 30 seconds to gather, netting you 1 lettuce every 2.4 seconds. Majority of the player base view breeding as a shortcut to powerful pals, but I see it as a massive investment. Nearly every level 4 work pal is locked behind huge or giant eggs. You could be waiting anywhere from 30 minutes to over an hour per incubation on the default settings. And that's even before you factor in kick production and having to do multiple attempts at breeding. If you are playing on the default settings, then the excessively breeding is usually slowing you down rather than speeding you up. Let me be clear. I do not think breeding is a bad mechanic, I just think it is massively overrated. If you have ever searched for a breeding guide that looked like the family tree from the House of Targaryens, which definitely does work in Game of Thrones and in Palworld, but each breeding step adds virtually another 30 minutes to several hours of gameplay that you could have spent progressing. I have also developed what I believe to be the most efficient breeding path for players who still prefer to breed their base pals. We can incorporate easily obtainable wild pals in the early game for each step, dramatically reducing the time needed to reach your target pal. Remember, breeding should be supporting your progression, not replacing it. And despite my anti-breeding stance on most base pals, there is one pal that must absolutely be bred in every playthrough, and that pal is Yakumo. If you have ever spent any time researching rainbow traits, you would actually know that they are relatively easy to obtain. However, something most guides neglect is that different regions contain a different pool of water pals that can actually be caught via fishing. And this leads to complications when passing down its traits due to the breeding trees. But that is where Yakumo comes in. Not only does it have a short incubation period of 5 minutes, it can also be bred with any pals obtained in the starter regions with the desired rainbow trait in one singular breeding step. In other words, you can utilize Yakumo to pass down the remarkable craftsmanship trait onto level 4 worker pals that I mentioned earlier without having to breed them. And this works exceptionally well with pals such as Gangler, Raloha, and Splatterinas, which spawn in large quantities. Moving on to tip 6. This tip is surprisingly unknown despite being one of the most important concepts for early game progression. Most players assume that the mining sites are the default go-to sources of materials, but they are not. To test this, I assigned a level 2 mining soothsayer to gather ore for 10 minutes from 3 different sources: the natural ore nodes, a level 1 mining site, and a level 2 mining site, and these were the results. Simply put, natural resource nodes are much more efficient in the early to mid game of your server. But if that was the case, why are mining sites virtually everyone's recommendation? They are definitely superior, but for a different reason. Because unlike the natural nodes, mining sites will never run out. They provide you a constant stream of resources 24 hours a day, allowing your high-level mining pals to work indefinitely. That's why, before obtaining a dedicated level 4 mining team, you should always be focusing on natural resource nodes and transition into mining sites once you have the team available and allow the automation to take over. This might be the most valuable event in the entire game, that is, capturing a wandering merchant as one of your base events is one of the strongest long-term investments as you can make, as it is the only source of unlimited Paldium fragments in the game right now. Although Paldium fragments can easily be obtained using crushers, this comes with a hidden cost. Not only do you need a mining pal to collect the stone, you also need to dedicate a watering pal to use the crusher to keep your production of Paldium fragments going. There is 2 base slots in the early game which you could easily replace by simply purchasing the fragments for a cheap price of 20 gold each. By using gold coins and purchasing Paldium fragments instead, not only do you free up your base slots, but you also save valuable time that you could spend on other activities and resources instead. Because sometimes the fastest way to progress isn't just producing more resources, but eliminating unnecessary tasks altogether. One of the biggest mistakes players make is to evaluate pals based on how quickly they gather resources in the endgame. The reality is, the best pals depend entirely on where you are in your progression. For example, Life Monk is incredibly valuable as a pal on day 1 of your server, as they not only serve as the requirement for an early game quest, but they also provide exactly what you need at the beginning of the game, which is wood and fiber. Because progression isn't about finding the best base pal, but finding the right pal at the right time. This realization completely changed the way I approach Palworld. Resource gathering in Power is a linear process. For example, a level 4 mining pal does gather more resources than a level 1 mining pal. But that doesn't suddenly generate an infinite amount of resources. You still need to invest the time and infrastructure to gather the resources and use them effectively. This means that every inefficiencies in your progression will compound over time, and people think they must begin chasing better pals, better equipment, and better gear. The reality is, Power is a sandbox resource management game and is designed to create artificial scarcity throughout the game, and only providing you with a limited number of resources to get through certain aspects of the game. Instead of chasing better pals or better gears, it's more important to think ahead and begin preparing for your shortages in your resources before they happen, rather than after. But this is where my last tip comes in. Everyone's progression is stuck due to a bottleneck they have at that point in the game, and how quickly you get to progress is determined by how quickly you identify and eliminate this bottleneck. It's easy to look at your base and identify the dozen of problems you have with it. You usually only have one factor that is holding everything back, and the mistake most players make is to try and improve everything all at once. So, the tip is simply, the fastest way to progress is to identify your bottleneck and fix that first. Because progression in Power isn't about building the best and biggest base, it's about building the most efficient one. I know that some of these tips, especially towards the end, might feel a little bit broad, because rather than giving a list of instructions and telling you exactly what to do, I wanted to focus more on the concepts that drives my progression in Palworld. The reality is that every server, challenge, and playthrough is different. So there isn't really a single solution that works for everyone. That being said, in my next video, I will be breaking down my early game strategy step by step, showing exactly how I apply these concepts and the thought process behind every major decision. It's one thing for me to always talk about efficiency, it's another for me to demonstrate it in practice. So if you think that sounds interesting, consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously and lets me continue making these deep dives into Power's mechanics, progression strategies, and lesser known tips. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.